The purpose of this video lecture is to focus on what are often called the historical books. So in the last lecture, we looked at the Pentateuch, we looked at the Exodus, all the way through to the Law, into Deuteronomy, the blessings and curses. And now we actually have gotten to the place where they're going to get into the Promised Land, and all of it's going to kind of culminate in the person of David. In the Jewish tradition, these books are actually referred to as the former prophets, which I think is more helpful. When we call them historical books, I think we fall into the trap of trying to treat them like modern history. And as we've talked about already, that's problematic. They're not trying to give us exactly what happened. They're interpreting the events in a way to speak about God's action and identity and those types of things. Now, what's also interesting is the historical books are taken as a chunk from Joshua till 2nd Kings. 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles tell the same story, but they're written differently and written probably by different people. 1st and 2nd Chronicles are part of a group of books that we won't spend a lot of time on in this course, but they're called the writings. And the book of Joshua, which is interesting, could also be connected back to the Pentateuch. In fact, some biblical scholars argue for what they would call a hexateuch. 6 books, that Genesis through Joshua should be taken as a unit, because Joshua is the culmination of coming into the Promised Land. And that argument is kind of interesting. I think it has some merit to it. But we're going to look at the books of Joshua, Judges, all the way through 1st and 2nd Kings, and try to give some kind of overarching arc to the narrative and see kind of what's going on, connected back to what we've looked at in the Pentateuch and the Exodus event. So the first book that is important, and by the way, one of the things, there's too much information to really cover, to go through each book, all the themes in each book. So what I'm trying to do is simply give you some coat hooks upon which you can read or hang your reading of the text. So as you eventually read the book of Joshua, for example, what are the coat hooks that we can put on to read better? So the book of Joshua, what's fascinating about it is it's all about God giving the land. Now, we put this in the context of the covenant, the suzerain vassal covenant that we've been talking about. Remember, the greater is the one who does the action on behalf of the lesser. And so it's important to see that theme in the book of Joshua. Again and again, it is God who is acting, and the people are simply expected to be faithful. And again, there's this phrase in where it talks about how the Lord is the one who will give the land to them. The Lord is the one who will fight for them. Throughout Joshua, we see that. You see the picture of the painting of the Battle of Jericho there. And the people are very passive again. They're commanded to walk around the walls, blow their trumpets and things like that. But they are not the ones who bring the walls down. Their faithfulness to do what God tells them to do, God acts, and they're called simply to be faithful. So we see this in the beginning of the book where it opens up with this. Joshua 1. If you have your Bibles with you, please open up and kind of follow along. So Joshua 1:1. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' aide, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I am about to give them, to the Israelites. I will give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses. Your territory will extend from the desert to Lebanon, from the great river of the Euphrates to all the Hittite country to the great sea on the west. No one will be able to stand up for you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. So that notion of the giving of the land, the Lord tells Joshua that he is the one who is going to give them the land. The Lord, later on, the angel of the Lord talks about how it is the Lord who will fight for them and give them the land. Now, what we're going to see is throughout the historical books, there's this tension. Israel will want to do it on their own terms, especially when we get to the book of Judges, and we'll see Gideon, where there's a tension between this idea that the Lord is the one who will do the fighting, and the Lord will be the one who will give it to them, and Gideon wanting to do it for himself, and the Israelites wanting to put their trust in warriors and chariots and so on. And so this is really the tension that moves through the book of Joshua, moves through the historical books, all the way to Saul and David. Saul is someone who is of military strength and might, is a big guy, all the armor. David is the one who trusts in the Lord. So that tension moves through the whole book. It goes all the way back to the Tower of Babel, right? We want to build a city for ourselves, make a name for ourselves, versus the Lord being the one to make a name for us. And then we hear this in verse 6, be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their forefathers to give them. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Do not let this book of the law depart from your mouth. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you will be prosperous and successful. So that's at the beginning of the book. And then when we get to the end of the book, Joshua 23, what we find is this. Be very strong to be careful to obey all that is written in the book of the law of Moses without turning aside to the right or to the left. Do not associate with these nations that remain among you. Do not invoke the names of their gods or swear by them. You must not serve them or bow down to them, but you are to hold fast to the Lord your God as you have till now. And then he goes on to say, okay, be careful to love the Lord. Verse 12, but if you turn away and ally yourself with the survivors of these nations that remain among you, and you intermarry with them and associate with them, then you may be sure that the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations before you. Instead, they will become snares and traps for you. Now, what I want you to see is that Joshua, this is the analogy I use. Joshua functions like an Oreo cookie. A sandwich. The two cookie parts are Joshua 1 and Joshua 23. Be careful to obey the law that the Lord has given you. Do not turn from the right or to the left, and it will go well with you. So the middle part, the cream part, is the giving of the land. The giving of the land is framed by Torah faithfulness. If they remain faithful, the Lord will give them the land. And at the end, we get that hint of if you do not remain faithful, there'll be snares and traps for you. It'll be problematic for you. So again, it's important to see how this covenant piece is grounded in the text. The Lord gives them the land, but frames it in the context of Torah faithfulness. Remain faithful to Torah, and it will go well with you. This is back to the Adam story. God places Adam in the garden, gives him his word, says, obey, you live here. Disobey, and you'll be cursed. Right? Do not eat of the tree. So that we have to read the Genesis text in light of the Joshua text. That what's happening here is that Adam is kind of a typology, right? An archetype of Israel. And so hopefully you can begin to see how these narratives are interplaying with each other and kind of pushing into each other. Now, throughout the book, what you find in Joshua 8 and Joshua 24 is covenant renewal. If covenant is at the center of this, what happens is the people are constantly called to renew covenant. So they come before the Lord, they read the law, and they renew their vows before the Lord. Again, because the covenant is central to what this book is actually doing. By the way, for those of you who are Reformed, our worship style is actually a form of covenant renewal. We gather together, and this is why we read the law and why we hear the gospel every Sunday, is because we're coming before our God to renew covenant with him, and that's the focus of our worship service. And that's why there's a little formality to it, because these types of ceremonies are formal, and we're coming before our King to renew covenant. Now, the book of Joshua ends and points ahead a little bit to the book of Judges. So the people come into the land, and we get these hints of disobedience with Achan and some of these other people, but it's pushing ahead to the book of Judges. And so when we get to Judges, what we find now is, I'm going to put it this way, it's actually a new creation story. So remember back to the Genesis account. So what we heard in the Genesis account was there was darkness and chaos, and remember what Walton was saying, God is going to bring order out of the chaos, bring function out of that chaos. What we're getting in the Judges cycle is the beginning of a new creation story. The The first creation story starts in the darkness and it leads to Adam and Eve living in the Garden of Eden. The second creation story, I would argue, is the Exodus. It begins in the darkness and death of the plague, and it moves into Joshua where they take the promised land. This new creation story, this new cycle, begins in the book of Judges, where you get chaos. Everyone does what is right in their own eyes, right? So Judges chapter 2, verse 1. The angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochum and said, I brought you up out of Egypt and led you into the land that I swore to give your forefathers. I said, I will never break my covenant with you. You shall not make a covenant with the people of this land, but you shall break down their altars. Yet you have disobeyed me. Why have you done this? Now therefore I tell you that I will not drive them out before you. They will be thorns in your sides, and their gods will be a snare. When the angel of the Lord had spoken these things to all the Israelites, the people wept aloud. And they called the place Bochum. There they offered sacrifices. Now, what's fascinating is again and again, throughout this book, you're going to hear this refrain, everyone did what was right in their own eyes, throwing us back into the darkness and chaos of the Genesis text, and also you could argue that the Tower of Babel story. But what we also see here is this hint of disobedience leading to exile. Adam eats of the tree and is cursed and is kicked out of the promised land, or kicked out of the garden. And here we're going to begin to see the echoes of the same type of thing, that disobedience is what is going to lead to exile. Now, Judges 3, just to set the pattern here, Judges 3, 7 through 11 sets the pattern. So there's a cycle to the book of Judges, and every judge follows this pattern. Well, let's see here. All right, well, this is the first judge, Othniel. So the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They forgot the Lord, their God, and served the Baals and the Asherahs. The anger of the Lord burned against Israel, so that he sold them into the hands of Cush-Rathaimion, king of Aram, to whom the Israelites were subject for 8 years. But when they cried out to the Lord, he raised up for them a deliverer, Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him, so that he became Israel's judge and went to war. The Lord gave Cusham-Rishathaim, king of Aram, into the hands of Othniel, who overpowered him. So the land had peace for 40 years until Othniel, son of Kenaz, died. So what we see here is this pattern. Every judge has a pattern of there's disobedience. Everybody does evil or what is right in their own eyes in the sight of the Lord. They're sent into exile, which means a foreign power comes and rules over them. Israel cries out. And then the Lord raises up a deliverer who comes and defeats the enemy and gives them freedom. Now, what's interesting, so the picture on here is actually the judge Ehud, and that's actually the next one in chapter 3. I'm not going to read it, but it's a fascinating story because it talks about Ehud the left-handed, and it's because he's left-handed that they don't search right for him, and he can bring a knife in and kills the king. And what's fascinating about it is now here they kind of have him on looks like a throne, but reality, what the text is the king is going to the bathroom. And so Ehud is able to kill him on the crapper, basically, and stab him, and it's very graphic in how it describes it. But these stories are fascinating in how they talk about the disobedience and the exile and the deliverer that the Lord raises up for them. Now, there are 3 primary narratives in the story. So Deborah are 3 main judges. The first one is Deborah, chapters 4 and 5. Basically, the text or the narrative comes to us in chapter 4. Deborah is a prophetess who actually steps in because the male who is supposed to be helpful is not helpful, and she kind of props him up. It's interesting because the Deborah story actually raises all sorts of questions about what we think about leadership and the role of women in the church and so on. The picture here is of Jael, who chases down this army general and then drives a stake through his temple. So Deborah is raised up to kind of lead the people and free them. So verses 6 through 9. You get the different characters in the narrative. I won't read that. But what's also important then is after they defeat the powers, you get this song of Deborah. in chapter 5. And if you connect, it's important to connect these things, that the Song of Deborah connects to Hannah's prayer. So if you go to the book of Samuel, when Hannah discovers that she's pregnant, going to have a child, right, she gives this prayer. And it's also connected with Mary's song. And all of these are very political. So it's interesting. We don't always think of Christmas in political terms. But if you go and read Mary's song and read it in the context of Deborah's song, what Deborah is talking about is the poor being raised up and overthrowing these powers. And Mary's song does the same thing, that rulers will be cast down. Those who are hungry will be fed. It's fascinating. And I think it forces us as Christians to rethink how we celebrate Christmas, that it's much more political in the sense of a new king and a new world order and a new order of things that has broken into the world because of the kingdom of God. But it's important to make that connection of Mary's song back in the Gospel of Luke, back to the story of Deborah. The second one is the Gideon story. And the Gideon story is fascinating because the focus of it is all about who gets the power and glory. It's also interesting because we often think of the golden fleece here with Gideon as a positive thing, right? You throw out the fleece to test God. But in the context of the power struggle, the fleece is actually a negative thing. Gideon is engaged in a power struggle with God. Who will get the glory for freeing the Israelites? Will it be the Lord or will it be Gideon? So look at chapter 7, verses 2 and 3. The Lord said to Gideon, "You have too many men for me to deliver Midian into your hands, in order that Israel may not boast against me, that her own strength has saved her. Announce now to the people." Right? So the Lord keeps winnowing down his army. Why? Because he's afraid that the Israelites will think that they're the ones who delivered themselves. So again, it's a power struggle. Look at verse 12 of chapter 7, where it says, "The Midianites and the Amalekites and all other eastern people had settled in the valley, thick as locusts. Their camels could no more be counted than the sand on the seashore. Gideon arrived just as a man was telling a friend his dream. 'I had a dream,' he was saying. 'A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed.' His friend responded, 'This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites into the whole camp into his hands.' When Gideon heard the dream and its interpretation, he worshipped God. He returned to the camp of Israel and called out, 'Get up, the Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands.' Dividing the 300 men into 3 companies, he placed trumpets and empty jars in the hands of all of them, with torches inside. 'Watch me,' he told them. 'Follow my lead. When I get to the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do. When I and all who are with me blow our trumpets, then from all around the camps blow yours and shout, for the Lord and for Gideon.'" Now that last line is what is key. For the Lord and for Gideon. You can see the power struggle here, right? Gideon wants to take credit for it. And throughout the whole narrative, we get this tension between Gideon and the Lord. The Lord is the one who will do it for Gideon, and Gideon wanting to take credit for it. And then we end up at the end of the story in idolatry, which should remind us of a couple of different things. First of all, the golden calf, back in the Exodus account, but also the Tower of Babel. So chapter 22 of chapter 8, or verse 22 of chapter 8. "The Israelites said to Gideon, 'Rule over us, you, your son, and your grandson, because you have saved us out of the hand of Midian.' But Gideon told them, 'I will not rule over you, nor my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you.'" So he's saying the right thing here. "And he said, 'I do have one request, that each of you give me an earring from your share of the plunder.' It was the custom of the Ishmaelites to wear gold earrings. They answered, 'We'll be glad to give them.' So he spread out a garment, and each man threw a ring of his plunder onto it. The weight of the gold rings he asked for came to 1,700 shekels, not counting the ornaments." Verse 27, "Gideon made the gold into an ephod, which he placed in Ophrah, his town. All Israel prostituted themselves by worshiping it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and his family." So again, you see the tension between Gideon and the Lord. He says the right things, the Lord will rule, but then he creates really this idolatrous ephod, which is, an ephod is kind of part of a garment that a priest would wear. But we need to be thinking about this in the context of the golden calf, right? Because they brought their earrings and they gave them to Aaron, and Aaron constructs this golden calf to try to worship the Lord, but worship the Lord wrongly. And the same thing we get here. But we have to see the tension that exists, and this is the same tension that's going to happen with David. We're going to see David commit two sins, and Gideon kind of prefigures the sins that David is going to commit. That's grounded in the tension here between the Lord as the one who saves and acts, and Israel wanting to create for themselves and do things for themselves. The Samson narrative is the third one. And the Samson narrative also, you get, really this symbolizes the story of Israel. There are some pastors who will read the Samson narrative during Advent, and I've heard sermons during the Advent season leading up to Christmas that use the Samson story to prepare for the discussion of Jesus' birth. So hear this from chapter 13 of Judges. A certain man of Zorah named Manoah from the clan of the Danites had a wife who was sterile and remained childless. The angel of the Lord appeared to her and said, "You are sterile and childless, but you are going to conceive and have a son. Now see to it that you drink no wine or other fermented drink, and that you do not eat anything unclean, because you will conceive and give birth to a son. No razor may be used on his head, because the boy is to be a Nazirite, set apart to God from birth, and he will begin the deliverance of Israel from the hands of the Philistines." Okay? Samson here symbolizes the people of Israel. Birthed out of darkness. So by the way, one of the ways to think about the virgin birth, why is God so obsessed with using women who can't conceive or who are virgins? Why is the virgin birth of Jesus so important? It has nothing to do with, the divinity and humanity of Jesus. It has everything to do with the symbolism of God bringing forth life out of darkness. Again, back to the Genesis accounts, back to the Exodus account. Out of the darkness and chaos of Genesis 1, God brings order and creates his people. Out of the darkness and death of the Exodus, God creates the people of Israel. So here we see Samson in the same way. He represents the people of Israel who were supposed to be set apart, not drinking and not fornicating with the Gentile women. And if you know this story, and if you don't, you should read it, you know that Samson doesn't live up to his vows, that he ends up fornicating with women, Delilah, the Philistines. He ends up going by a dead carcass, which is what he wasn't supposed. In other words, he was supposed to be holy and set apart, and he fails in that whole thing. He defiles himself with Gentile women and dead bodies. He breaks the covenant and he betrays his identity. But this is the interesting thing about the story. He goes into exile. His hair is cut. His eyes are gouged out. And he is sent into exile. And when Israel would read this narrative, Israel would hear her own exile. Whether it's slavery in Egypt or whether it's being kicked out into Babylon. But what's fascinating about it is that it's Samson's suffering and death that leads to redemption. It is in the midst of exile and in his death that he brings freedom and defeats the enemies of God's people. Now, you hopefully could see how this resonates with the Jesus story, but it also is Israel's story. So in the next lecture, we'll look at the prophets, and we'll see how Isaiah talks about the suffering servant, and we need to read that as Israel, through her exile, through her suffering, God would bring about Israel's redemption. So these are the three primary narratives of the Judges account. And Judges is actually pushing us ahead to think about David. So the whole book ends, and there's other stories in there as well. These are the three main kind of Judges narratives. The last verse of the book is, "In those days Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit." It's trying to push us ahead to think about David. And so again, it's a creation story. So Judges is talking about the chaos of sin and so on, and breaking covenant, and is pushing ahead to the Redeemer for them will be David. David will become the figure towards which these narratives are moving. So we're going to skip over Ruth. It's a fascinating book, and there's so much in it, but for the sake of time, it's really trying to connect us to the history of David. It's moving us out of the Judges story and bringing us into the Samuel story. So again, I just said this, that this is a new creation story, that the Judges through 2 Samuel is a new creation story that culminates in David, the king, who is really the new Adam in a new promised land. Now, what's interesting also is the issue of kingship is one that has tension throughout the Bible. Is the king a good thing or a bad thing? So when you read 1 Samuel, what you find is that Samuel seems to be saying, when they want a king, Israel cries out for a king, they're rejecting God as king, right? So it's a negative thing. And yet we find in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 14, when you enter the land the Lord God is giving you and have taken possession of it and settled it, and you say, let us set a king over us like the nations around us, be sure to appoint over you the king the Lord your God chooses. Right? It assumes that they're going to have a king. So there is this weird tension through the historical books about whether the kingship is a good thing or a bad thing. Now, we won't talk a lot about Solomon later on, but what is fascinating about this is if I keep reading the Deuteronomy text, it says, be sure to appoint over a king the Lord your God chooses. He must be from among your own brothers. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not a brother Israelite. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them, for the Lord has told you, you may not go back that way. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. Go read the Solomon narrative, and what you find is this picture of what a king isn't supposed to be is exactly what Solomon is, which raises the question, is Solomon a good guy or a bad guy? But we got to talk about David first. It's important to recognize that David becomes the ideal king, that the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings are setting David up to be the ideal king. The David and Goliath story, which we've already, I think, talked about at one point, sets David over and against Saul. Saul trusts in military strength. Like Gideon, Saul's temptation is to put his trust in horses and chariots, put his trust in military might and strength, and do it himself. Whereas David comes in, refuses the armor, and trusts in the Lord, not in military strength. Now, it's also important to realize that David represents kind of a mediator and a new Adam figure in 2 Samuel chapter 7. So when you get to 2 Samuel 7, what we see here is that David becomes this mediator. So listen to verse 1. After the king was settled in his palace, and the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies around him. Now, it seems like a small text, but this idea of rest is important. We have a Sabbath. David comes into Jerusalem, takes Jerusalem, establishes the kingdom. He is the new Adam. He is the one through whom God is going to rule his people as king. And we see this now in the context of rest. There is a new Adam in a new garden, a new mediator between God and his people. And we have to read the David story in this way. And this is why kingship is going to be important and positive. The king is a positive thing as long as the king represents God's reign. And we'll look at this here in a few minutes. The king has to keep the people in covenant. The king becomes the Torah keeper, the faithful one. It's like Israel has been reduced to one person. Think about Adam as an archetype representing humanity. Right now, David becomes the archetype that represents the people of Israel. And God's dealings with David is God's dealing with his people. We'll see this is why it's important to talk about the kingship of Jesus. Jesus becomes our king, our mediator, our representative. God's dealing with Jesus is his dealing with us. This is significant. Okay, and David is the Torah keeper. He is the one who represents the people. He is the one who keeps law for the people. So I hope these passages make sense. Sometimes I put passages in and they actually don't. So 1 Kings chapter 2. Chapter 2. All right, verse 1. When the time drew near for David to die, he gave a charge to Solomon. I'm about to go the way of all the earth, he said. Be strong. Think of Joshua. Be strong. Show yourself a man and observe what the Lord your God requires. Walk in his ways, keep his decrees and commands, his laws and his requirements, as it is written, so that you may prosper and that the Lord may keep his promise to me. Right? So it's about faithfulness. 1 Kings chapter 15, verses 3 through 5. Says so he's talking about Jeroboam. He committed all the sins his father had done before him. His heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his forefather had been. Nevertheless, for David's sake, the Lord God gave him a lamp in Jerusalem by raising up his son to succeed him. For David had done what was right in the eyes of the Lord, and had not failed to keep any of the Lord's commands all the days of his life, except in the case of Uriah the Hittite. Okay, throughout Kings, what you find is David becomes the standard. David is the Torah keeper by which all other kings are going to be judged, which is why in the next lecture, when we talk about the prophets, we're going to see David becomes the symbol. Why does David become the symbol for the Messiah or the future king? Because David is the ideal king by which all other kings are to be judged. Now, it's also important to recognize the failings of David in his disobedience. And there's two of them. And we don't have time necessarily to read through them, but you should read through these. 1 Samuel 11, hopefully you know the story of Bathsheba. David is back out from battle, and he's not doing what he's supposed to be doing. The king is supposed to be out leading the battle, and he's back at home messing around. And it talks about how he takes what doesn't belong to him. Right? He oversteps his boundary. Think of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He sees Bathsheba, he takes what doesn't belong to him, and then it leads to violence as Uriah the Hittite is killed. So we have all of the stuff all the way back into Genesis 1 through 11, or 3 through 11, I guess I should say, where sin and disobedience has these repercussions. And again, we get the echoes of the Judges here, where it's a question of, do we follow and are faithful to what God is doing, or do we do our own thing? The second thing is in 2 Samuel 24, where David takes a census. Now, you may say, who cares about counting people? Well, what he's doing is he's trying to create an army. So here we get this notion that David is putting his trust in military strength. Now, what makes David different from other kings is when Nathan confronts him, when the prophet confronts him, David always repents. So David becomes this ideal king who, even though is in many ways tempted and falls in the same way that Adam does and Israel is also going to do, David at least signifies a sense of repentance. And this is why he becomes the ideal king. Now, again, I want you to see, I know some of you struggled with this idea of an archetype in Walton's book, and Adam is an archetype, and this typology piece. This is where we see it. Is David a historical person and doing things? Absolutely. And so the text is grounded in these events and these things that David is doing. But the author wants you to see that David in many ways is symbolic of the new Adam. He is symbolic of Israel's experience and is also pointing ahead for us as Christians to Jesus Christ. And this is why Jesus gets connected with David, gets connected with the issue of kingship, and has everything to do with Jesus being our mediator. Eventually we'll talk about Jesus being prophet, priest, and king, but here we see the significance of kingship as the one through whom God deals with his people. It's also important to see how the disobedience of David connects back to the idolatry of the Tower of Babel and the golden calf and so on. So from David and from these historical books, we're going to move out and we're going to begin looking at the prophets. Again, we've skipped over a bunch of stuff in these books. And I recommend that you read through the Elijah and Elisha narratives and all of these things. As Israel becomes disobedient, as the king falls and becomes disobedient, there's raised up a prophetic voice in the history of Israel. But what I want to do is talk about the prophetic voice as it comes in the major prophets and in the minor prophets, and that will be our next lecture.